WinWing's first entry into rudder pedals with the Orion pedal set, so how did they do? As always, full disclosure, I was sent the unit for free for the purposes of review, and since pertinent to this review, this is the first high-end rudder pedal set that I've used, replacing the venerable CH Pro pedals that I've had for the last 8 or so years. So this will be from the perspective of a newcomer to high-end pedals. Alright, so the assembly was pretty easy. There's a little fiddly bits with the legs, but it's not too difficult and all the tools required are included. It's constructed of a stainless steel body and die-cast for the pedals. It also has some plastic dust covers on the spring mechanism for the brakes. Generally it's quite solid, although a little rudimentary, particularly the support legs, which keep it stable, but don't look too great. The wires for the brake axes also hang off the back, a minor concern if you ever get them caught on something, but otherwise it's a very solid bit of kit. All the axes are Hall effect sensors from using magnetic forces, being both very accurate and long-lived. The dimensions are pretty wide, mimicking real aircraft proportions, and the travel is up to 18 centimeters for about 38 degrees of movement. You can quite comfortably sit a centre-mounted joystick in the middle between them. Right away, when trying to use them, I ran into a bit of an issue. You see, it slips. The design actually comes with an anti-slip mat, but I actually found this to be worse in all circumstances. My room has carpet, and so it's not the best situation. I found that the springs are simply too strong, and that I will either push myself or the entire set backwards when I attempt to use full force, and they require about 10 kilograms of force, or up to 20 if you max out the damper kit. Personally, I think this really should have had some softer alternate springs, so you're going to have to figure this one out, because I just couldn't get it to sit still at the full forces required on my carpet. I ultimately resorted to bracing it up against the skirting board to get the full travel. Trying out vinyl flooring from my kitchen, it was a lot more stable. It more or less stayed put unless you hold full forces for a prolonged time, but I did find even with the mat, it actually slipped more than without. So ultimately this is something that is best mounted hard to a sim pit or braced up against something. Now the axes themselves, they're solid and smooth, they really are nice to control. And I really do appreciate the extra length on the axes movement, letting you do away with all the axes tuning that I've had to rely on in the past. You can also actually adjust the travel distance available by adjusting 2 screws. Now you can use this to in effect reduce the spring forces required by reducing the total travel, or you can just use it to tailor how much travel you want exactly. I did manage to reduce the travel to about 60%, and then I found that it would stay put on carpet if you wanted to, for example, as you have effectively reduced the spring forces required to reach 100%. Moving on to the pedals, now these axes are mostly smooth. You don't really notice it, but there is a tiny bit of stiction. You're only going to feel this if you really do test it slowly, like I have during review, where it'll jump just a little bit as you add pressure gradually. Otherwise, it really has worked well, there's no complaints there. In addition to the axes, you also get 2 virtual buttons for each pedal in case you need them for extra compatibility, along with more options inside SimMap Pro. You can also adjust the angle of the pedals. Now, there are 3 positions: reclined, middle, and up vertical. The vertical position is only going to work in a reclined sim pit position, and the flat position will work better closer to your feet. Ultimately, I found the middle position the most comfortable and easiest to use. Of course, these are pedals designed for resting your feet on the floor the majority of the time, so your pedals will be further away from your chair than you might otherwise expect from, say, my CH Pro pedals. However, there was one problem with my pedals. The right hand pedal clips the frame when you put it in the reclined position. Now ultimately this didn't matter for me, but this does show there's a bit of a tolerance issue in production here. A simple washer could fix this, but since I'm not going to use the position, it doesn't matter. So we've already mentioned the travel length adjustment and the pedal angle, but it also has 3 modes: the standard axes with toe brakes, and then you can lock it for improved car type controls using just the toe brakes, and finally you can go springless, which of course is best for helicopter use. There's an easy pull ring on the spring, and this of course gives you a much more relaxed leg position for long flights and helicopters, along with making it much more realistic to the aircraft that you're flying by no longer returning your pedals to centre. Now WinWing say it takes about 3 seconds to make these adjustments, and I definitely agree with what they say there. This makes it easy to use and convenient, and not one of those features that you just ignore because it's not worth the effort of changing it all the time. Now of course you are going to need a damper if you're going to go without the spring, because otherwise the pedals will be loose, and well, we'll speak about the damper now. This is something I would honestly just recommend you get anyway, whether or not you think you need it. It's cheap enough and it really is quite useful. It allows the pedals to be either very loose on the minimum force all the way up to treacle on the hardest setting, where it'll very slowly return to centre. Myself, I like to keep it roughly in the middle. Now it keeps the pedals from oscillating and jumping around, and it smooths out your inputs, which makes you more precise in general. However, it does have a tiny bit of play before the damper kicks in as the springs move on the cam. This results in the pedals having a bit of a dead zone where you have very light resistance before the damper kicks in, which is only really a problem on the highest damper settings and personally not bother me too much, but it's something to consider. Without it, of course, the pedals will oscillate quite a lot if you're very violent with them, and it will mess up your input slightly. When being used springless in a helicopter configuration, there is an additional issue. If you're making the most tiny of corrections, you're going to feel a tiny bit of stiction caused by that damper. This can make your corrections a little bit stop-start in some circumstance, whereas if you take the damper off without the spring, it is perfectly smooth. I prefer to run with the dampener using helicopters just because otherwise the pedals are free swinging, but it isn't quite perfect, so there's definitely some room for improvement there. But otherwise it's a very enjoyable experience using them with helicopters. Now overall I think I've had my flying and enjoyment of flying improved quite a lot, particularly with helicopters. My precision in general has gone up and I'm less reliant on finicky axes, curves and tuning performed in the software. I really do like the long travel, and of course if you can get it secure, it really is great. Now WinWing are looking at making customization kits with springs and cams and heel supported pedals, which would allow you to, for example, pull and push with the same foot, which should all help reduce the slipping issues. Personally I think this really should have come out with them, and it'll need at least a lighter spring, possibly a new cam, and it would certainly benefit from some heel on the pedals if you want to use it on carpet like I said. Unfortunately my setup is the worst case scenario for the pedals and traction, but you should have some pretty good success with traction on vinyl or wooden flooring. So WinWing's first entry into pedals, they've almost got it right. It's a really good set of pedals and I do love them. It's just that little issue with the traction. It's made things like taxiing and performing clearing turns as you go much easier and controlled, along with being just in general much nicer than my old pedals. There's no feeling of fighting with your own controls, and the soft centre detent works very nicely. On my old pedals I'd find myself fighting for precision whenever I had to cross the centre axis, and there's no such problem here. So if you're like myself and have carpet under your desk, well, you're going to have to think about how to secure it. I ultimately just braced it against the skirting board. But if you can't figure that one out, it is going to slip and you're not going to have the perfect setup. Hopefully WinWing will release some new hardware to make that much more manageable, but if you have a hardwood floor, vinyl or other means of mounting it such as a sim pit, it's easy to recommend this kit. If you only fly fixed-wing aircraft, you can afford to skip the damper, and whilst I still find it useful, the extra situational stiction and occasional grainy movement takes away from an otherwise smooth main axis, detracting a little overall. Unfortunately, I couldn't say if this is a limitation of rudder dampers in general, but it's something I feel needs minor improvement on with WinWing's design. Otherwise, it's a very solid contender for your attention, flexible multi-mode rudder pedal set. I'll leave you to the sound of hardware. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.